Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Conversations Over Coffee with Beth Tzedec Congregation in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. I'm Steve Wernick, Rabbi Wernick, one of the rabbis at Beth Tzedec, and I am happy to be with you each week at this time as we talk to interesting people about interesting things going on, not only in the Jewish world, but really a perspective of Jewish values beyond the Jewish world. Today, I'm really privileged to have as my guest Jeff Springer, who is the CEO and president of JNF Canada, the Jewish National Fund Canada. Jeff, thanks for being here. It's wonderful to be with you. We've certainly in the last couple of months have gotten to know each other as we're preparing for the Negev dinner, and we'll get to that in a little bit, but I always like to start with the personal. Tell us who you are and how you your journey that led you to be leading JNF in Canada.
Sure. Just to qualify, I'm the executive director of JNF in Toronto.
In Toronto,
yeah.
Okay.
So the CEO,
a little smaller platform, but still the biggest platform in Canada.
we are by far the largest, but yes, but I'm not the CEO of JNF Canada. Lance Davis, my colleague and friend, is the CEO. So how did I get to JNF? I grew up in Toronto. I'm a product of the day school system here. I went to Associated and to Chat. I went to the University of Toronto for undergrad, and like every Holocaust survivor's son, I wanted to be a doctor, dentist, accountant, or a lawyer. Those were my choices. So I chose dentistry. So I actually have a biology degree from U of T, and but somewhere around third year, I sort of shift gears and I got very involved in Hillel. I actually became the president and decided to, change course and into a career in Jewish communal service. And I went to Brandeis University and did a master's in Jewish communal service. And after I graduated, for the 28 years after that, I actually worked at the Federation, the UJ Federation in Toronto, in a variety of different roles. I was the campaign director. I worked in campaign for 18 years and ending up as campaign director. And then I became the senior vice president for corporate affairs. I did that for almost 10 years. And after leaving the Federation, I was so fortunate to land this position at JNF. I've been a lifetime Zionist. I've been to Israel. Well, it was a great product of my old job at UJA over 50 times, taking different missions of different groups of different sizes and of different ages. And I love Israel so much. So to be able to work for an organization that's all about Israel has really been a blessing for me. And that's really how I ended up here. I mean, fundraising is I'm not a stranger to that. As I said, I worked 18 years in the campaign department, and I'm married. I have 2 kids, and that's me.
So you probably heard this joke a million times, but being a fundraiser and a dentist, they're both like pulling teeth.
Especially from dentists, by the way.
Not everybody is familiar with the alphabet soup of the Jewish world. UJA, JNF, JTS, the Jewish National Fund. Help our viewers understand what is JNF and a little bit of its history.
Well, the initial JNF, the first JNF, actually is Kkl and Jnf, Kkl in English, was created in 1901 by the Zionist Congress, with Theodore Herzl and the Zionist Congress. And its role was to purchase land in what was then Palestine, and in order for Jewish settlement. It was simple as that. And they started off with the traditional blue box, that pushka that is so familiar to so many. That was the first Jewish fundraiser for Israel through Kkl.
Yeah, the first global Jewish fundraiser, for sure.
That's right, global through Kkl. And so until the establishment of the state, really, the Kkl and Jnf was devoted to purchasing land and making the land available for settlement. After the establishment of the state, things did change because there was a state. So there wasn't the need so much to purchase land, but it became an afforestation organization. One of its main goals was to plant trees in Israel, turn the land green, which was David Ben-Gurion's dream for the Negev. And over 250 million trees have been planted in Israel by Kkl with donations from around the world. And we're very proud to be part of that. And so
you have to share the most important statistic about that. That is that Israel is the only country that entered the 21st century with more trees than it did the 20th century.
That's correct. Yeah, very good,
Amazing.
Rabbi. That's very good. That's very true, actually. And while the amount of land that's available for planting today in Israel is reduced because there's so many trees, although unfortunately there was a very bad fire in the Jerusalem Hills this summer. The main planting actually in Israel is rehabilitation of forests, because there's forest fires every summer. It's not just the bad one we had this past summer, but rehabilitation of forests is a significant role that Kkl plays today. There's still planting happening in different areas of the country, but rehabilitation is a really, really big thing. And unfortunately, it takes many years for a forest to rehabilitate. And so we've actually this summer did launch a small campaign for the rehabilitation of the Jerusalem Hills. And the pictures are devastating. Like it really, if you think of what happened in California, obviously to a much smaller degree, that's the way it is. It's like gone. You look at mountains full of trees, and then you look at nothing. And it really is devastating. And one of our projects at the Etanim Psychiatric Hospital, which is in the Jerusalem Hills, the residents, the patients, I should say, had to be evacuated. The fire came right up to the hospital, like literally right on the fence. So it was pretty scary. We just had built 3 therapeutic gardens at the Etanim Hospital, and thank goodness the fire didn't get into the hospital, but stayed on the outskirts. So Jnf Canada has a history similar to Kkl's in the sense that when it was created, which is around 1948, which is actually around the establishment of the state, we were very involved in the environmental side of the organization, planting trees, parks, clearing land for settlement, water reservoirs, the real traditional mission of Kkl. Over the last decade or two, we've evolved a little bit and moved into the building of social infrastructure in Israel. And this year's Negative Dinner Project, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a few minutes, is really a good example of that. But having said that, we still are involved in the environmental aspects of JNF. And the prime example of that actually is a project which has been launched in Montreal, which will be going across the country, which is the Climate Solutions Prize. Some donors came together in Montreal and said, want to do something for climate change, and saw Israel as a great way to promote that. So they're raising money, actually now into the millions of dollars, which is fantastic. And there'll be a prize awarded in Israel of $1 million per year to a company or organization that wins a competition in climate tech. And so climate tech, not just to help the climate change in Israel, but really around the world. And so we're really— I
know a leading contender already, I bet.
We're really excited about that. And we hope to bring it to Toronto when the time is right. We think within the next 12 months, we'll be starting to raise some money for the Climate Solutions Prize. And again, so it just shows you how we have evolved into social infrastructure.
Is this going to be a JNF Canada prize, or there'll be different ones for Montreal and for—
No, it'll be a national prize.
It'll be a national prize.
Yeah, but having said that, there is a local component. So in Quebec, $1 million will be awarded in Israel, but $100,000 will be awarded in Quebec. So if we do the same thing here in Ontario or Toronto, we would also, if we raise enough money, we would be part of the $1 million awarded in Israel, but $100,000 would be awarded in Canada, in Toronto.
Out of the well, let me just ask, I don't know the answer to this. How much money does JNF Ontario, JNF Toronto raise on an annual basis?
It's an interesting question, actually, Rabbi, because it's a difficult answer. It's an easy answer to give, but not so easy to explain. Our revenue is very cyclical. It's almost like a roller coaster. And a lot of that depends on our negative dinners. Sometimes we have a negative dinner which raises, $4 or $5 million, and sometimes we have one that raises 1.5 or 1. So it creates this really cyclical or up and down kind of motion of revenue. But on a generalized basis, we raised in Canada about $12 or $13 million, and Toronto is usually about at least half of that.
And what percentage of the money raised, after you take care of expenses and so forth, what percentage of the money raised goes to environmental kinds of issues or the traditional JNF expenditures in Israel, and what percentage is going into these new areas of the social sector?
That's a good question. I don't have the numbers, handy. I would say, though, just anecdotally in my head, I would say about 75% is social infrastructure, and about 25% would be environmental.
Right. So it's almost been almost a complete shift.
I like to call it an evolution. Because it didn't happen overnight, but yeah.
And the need has changed, right? I mean, just, in some ways, there's a pat on the back. It's like, look how successful we've been. And the need is not as strong as perhaps at once, in the early days of the state, it was to build that infrastructure. And then now you have a state that's also taking care of a lot of those things.
For sure.
So the challenges change.
Yeah, I agree. But having said that, the Climate Solutions Prize will tip that definitely more toward 50-50 once it launches.
Yeah, well, that would make sense if it's $1 million prize
per year. Yeah,
per year, right? Great. So, what are the things that I should say something? You should know something about me in terms of this, where the question's coming from. So, as a former CEO of USCJ, of United Synagogue of Conservative Judaism, I've been involved with Merkaz Olami and with Merkaz, obviously Canada and the USA, and I'm on the board of governors of the Jewish Agency. And so, for people that are watching, Kkl, JNF in Israel, is one of the institutions that are called the National Institutions of the Jewish People. The WZO, the World Zionist Organization, is kind of the umbrella organization. It's the parliament of the Jewish people from around the world. And the WZO created the Jewish Agency, which was the instrument of Aliyah and the preparation of the institutions of the state before the state of Israel. They created Kkl, the Jewish National Fund for purchasing of land and forestation and environment in Israel. And they also created Kkl Hayasod, which is like, the international federation system, in order to support what first was to support Aliyah and the establishment of the Jewish state. And so Kkl, JNF in Israel is not necessarily the same thing as JNF around the world, though there are relationships. And Kkl, all these institutions, I should say, for those that are watching, all these institutions are political to the extent that the people who run them in Israel are political appointments that are made from the WZO, and the delegation, the power in the WZO is related to the Knesset strength, in whichever parties have leadership within the Knesset, as well as the voting that take place around the world every 5 years or so for the World Zionist Organization, for the World Zionists. So the more you vote, the more power the different movements and institutions that you might and the values that you might value are expressed within these institutions. So Kkl, whoever leads it, and whichever parties from the WZO have the most amount of influence in the WZO, they have the most amount of influence within Kkl. So that background, I think, is important in order to understand the question I'm going to ask, because I know that the leadership of Kkl hasn't always matched with what we might call as normative Canadian Jewish values when it comes to Israel and its relationship with the Palestinians and the West Bank, and so forth. And so that's caused into question the relationship of JNF and Kkl in the last 5 to 10 years, being a newbie to Canada, it's like, I think it's in the last 5-10 years. So my question, Jeff, is like, help us understand this alphabet soup of relationships, especially the relationship between JNF Canada and Kkl, and how we respond to the challenges of being Zionist, but not always in support of the policies of the Israeli government, and how all of that works and how we navigate that.
Yeah, well, definitely an interesting question, to say the least, because it is somewhat. Well, it's actually a relatively simple answer, but a complicated background. The background you illustrated is actually quite correct. Kkl is one of the national institutions. Its board consists only of Israelis, unlike the Jewish Agency. And more recently, because of some issues that Kkl had in Israel, it's become a public foundation, which so it has become more transparent than it was in the past. In the past, it was pretty quiet.
Boys Club.
Yeah, kind of, definitely. Interestingly, the leadership of Kkl didn't necessarily reflect the government for whatever reason. The previous head of the Kkl was a Laborite, whereas Likud was in power, so it doesn't quite match up 100% from that perspective.
No, but that was part of the horse trading of the
exactly
of the WZO, right? So
right.
the WCO was led by a Laborite,
right? Exactly.
Or by a Likud.
Exactly. So there's a lot of this.
As was the Jewish Agency. Natan Sharansky was appointed by Bibi Netanyahu. He was a Likudnik. So
correct. So there's a lot of that horse trading going on, for sure. The current chair of Kkl is a member of the right wing. Sorry, I just want to phone call. So what's the relationship between Kkl and JNF? I mean, for many, many years, for decades, actually, every project that JNF Canada did was with Kkl. We were very much partners, although not legally, partners in building the state. But it's important to note that we weren't legal partners, and we still aren't. JNF Canada is an independent Canadian organization. We're not a regional office of Kkl. We have our own board, we make our own decisions. And today, many of our projects are not done with Kkl. Actually, our environmental ones tend to be, for sure, but a lot of our social infrastructure projects are not. They're done with independent NGOs in Israel. We create agency agreements with them, or they have Canadian arms, either one, and we fund fantastic, very impactful projects in Israel directly and not through Kkl. We do still do some even social infrastructure projects with Kkl. We have the advantage of accessing matching funds actually through Kkl, which is great. But when it comes to the governance of Kkl, we have no influence, and more importantly, the opposite is true as well. They have no influence over our governance. We're completely independent, and we are required to be by Canadian law.
Right. And so when JNF makes decisions as where it's going to invest in Israel, it can be directed. That giving is directed giving. That matches the values of the Canadian leadership of the Jewish community on JNF.
Yeah, our Kkl projects are direct. They're designated gifts. So if Kkl is doing a project that we want to fund, our funds go directly to Kkl, who give that directly to pay for that particular project, and we receive receipts to prove the fact that only our funds were used for this project, and actually that's also a requirement by CRA. So it's not intermingled. So if Kkl makes a decision that we're not happy with, we may not be happy about it, but our funds have no effect on that.
And so I would say to anybody who's watching who does want to have influence on those decisions, again, vote in the WZO elections that happen every 5 years. And if you vote for Zionist parties like Merkaz, which is the Zionist party of the conservative movement, then our values as a centrist religious movement will be expressed in these conversations. But thanks, Jeff. That's a very important distinction. I know it's something that's important on the minds of at least a lot of people who trying just to understand the way that it works. Let's turn now to the Negev dinner. This is now the second year Negative dinner is going to be impacted by COVID. It's a night of 100 dinners is how it's being billed. Tell us about the negative dinner for this year.
Yeah, so it is the second year, as you mentioned, that we're going virtual, although this year we're a little bit more hybrid virtual in the sense that last year we weren't able to gather in groups at all. COVID regulations just did not allow us to gather in any group size whatsoever. So individual meals were sent to homes, over 100 homes. We actually were a night of 100 dinners, where people enjoyed a lovely dinner and had a really enjoyable, and I thought entertaining virtual program. So this year is similar in that way, except that we are allowed to have some gathering of people because things have improved here in Ontario. So we will have several homes with groups of 10 or more, and plus individual meals sent out, and then of course the broadcast will be available to donors of $360 and above. And we're very fortunate to have President Isaac Herzog, the President of the State of Israel, be part of the program. He'll be answering questions from Deborah Lipstadt, who is an eminent historian at Emory University and is the nominated anti-Semitism monitor for the Biden administration. And so we're really happy about that.
She's the Erwin Kotler of the U.S.
Exactly. Actually, that's actually Erwin Kotler's actually because the American position was first, but
right. So, but people might know Erwin, but not know that.
Correct.
It's the same position.
Right. Same position, exactly, and it's ambassadorial level in the U.S.
Yeah.
So we're thrilled to have both of them, and they'll be engaging virtually in a pseudo conversation on issues facing the Jewish world, not just about anti-Semitism, although that clearly will be addressed because of Professor Lipstadt's background. And we are very, very pleased and privileged to honor 19 spiritual leaders of Toronto congregations, including yourself, Rabbi Wernick. Rabbis and other spiritual leaders we believe are the unsung heroes of the pandemic. The support and caring that the spiritual leaders have done for their congregations and for the community at large has largely been unrecognized, and we're happy to recognize that and to recognize these individuals for the work that they do for their congregations and for the community. And we're also very excited because we found a wonderful project to fund from the proceeds from the negative dinner, and that is a residence called A Home for Life. It's a residence for young adults with autism that's being built in Ra'anana. There's a few of these around the country, and they're very successful. They allow the residents to live as independently as they can. I mean, depending on where they are on the spectrum. Most of them are definitely on the more difficult side of the spectrum. That's why they're in A Home for Life. But nevertheless, they try to live as independently as possible, and it gives such comfort to their parents that their children have a place to live, where they can grow and not to be morbid, the parents know that they have a place for their children when they're no longer there, because that is a major concern for parents of kids with this degree of autism, and it really gives them a great deal of comfort, and a lot of them just thrive. They thrive in that environment, so we're thrilled to be part of it.
Next time I'm in Israel, I'll have to make it a point to go and visit, since I'm
you'll see a plaque
part of the
with your
group of
name on it.
colleagues that are being honored for this. It's it's an important charitable contribution to the state of Israel.
Yep.
And help people. And I'm honored to be amongst a group of colleagues to be noted that way. And I feel privileged to be part of the Beth Tzedec community, where that acknowledgement of the work that my colleagues and I here have done over the course of the pandemic is something that we regularly feel the love of our community for doing that. And I know from being both at the Toronto Board of Rabbis meetings recently and also a Rabbinical Assembly of Ontario meeting that, there have been some articles about in E-Jewish Philanthropy too, that rabbinic burnout as a result of the pandemic is a real thing. And so for JNF to come together as a communal organization and recognize the work of our spiritual leaders, not just the 19 rabbis that are there, but really all the spiritual leaders of our communities, it's really meaningful. So we thank you for that. When is the dinner going to take place?
It's actually almost around the corner. It's Sunday, November the 14th. And if anyone wants any information or wants to make a contribution or buy a table or order meals, whatever the case may be, they can go to torontonegevdinner.ca. All the information is there, including an online form to make a donation or to order meals. And it's going to be a lovely evening. I mean, it'll be definitely spread around amongst the community, but there will be a sense of community, which I think is so important. One of the things the Negev Dinner does every single year, and it's been doing it now, and this will be the 73rd year, is really bring that sense of community around Israel. There's lots of larger gathering. There are other gatherings, not necessarily as large, but large gatherings, but don't necessarily focus only on Israel, whereas this one does. And we look forward, hopefully next year, to be gathering in a ballroom with 1,500 people like we're used to. But at least this way, in a real sense, we can still feel part of a community.
Yeah, but my first Negev dinner was my first year here, just before COVID, and it was phenomenal to see that many people gathered for a pro-Israel event, and also the diversity of views. We are a people that can have unity without unanimity. And I think the Negev dinner certainly reflects that. What's the goal for the dinner this year?
We're hoping to raise $1 million. We're on our way. I think today we're at around 700,000. So we're in the home stretch. We're not there yet. So if anybody listening wants to help, that would be great.
All right. Last word, Jeff.
I just want to thank you so much, Rabbi, for inviting me to be part of your conversations over coffee. Unfortunately, I don't drink coffee, but I'm still very happy to have a conversation.
I wish I would have known that beforehand. I would have gotten somebody in the office who did.
I do have my water bottle.
You do have your water bottle. Okay. All right. The conversation's over Mayim.
Exactly. Mayim. No, I'm kidding. I just really wanted to thank you and thank listeners for listening to a little bit of conversation about JNF, about Israel, and about our Negev dinner. So thanks so much.
Thanks, Jeff, for joining us. Negev dinner is on November 14th. Lots of fun things happening at Beth Tzedec. This Sunday, October 31st, is the first annual Bark Tzedec congregation. We're going to bless our pets that have been such a blessing for us, not just during the pandemic, but every day. We'll have a virtual event followed by a pet and parent gathering at the Cedar Vale Off-Leash Park. All the information for this wonderful opportunity and for all the opportunities to engage and be inspired to live a meaningful Jewish life, check us out online, www.beth-tzedec.org. Thanks everyone for joining us. Have a wonderful day and a Shavua